It began in a town where nothing ever seemed to happen, until one October night when someone vanished without a trace. Ocilla, Georgia, a quiet place tucked away in the southern countryside, where pecan orchards line the roads and neighbors wave to one another from their front porches. It was the kind of town where the church bells still rang on Sunday, where the biggest events were high school football games and beauty pageants. But beneath that simplicity was a story that would grip the nation. The story of a woman whose life seemed picture-perfect, until it suddenly wasn't. Her name was Tara Grinstead. To her students, she was the teacher who never forgot to encourage the shy kid in the back row. To her friends, she was the woman who always lit up a room with her smile. And to her community, she was more than a teacher. She was their own beauty queen, the hometown girl who once stood proudly on the stage at the Miss Georgia pageant. But Tara wasn't just admired. She was loved. She invested herself in every role she played, as a history teacher at Irwin County High School, as a mentor for young women competing in local pageants, and as a daughter and sister whose warmth seemed endless. At just 30 years old, she had already become the kind of figure people looked up to. Still, beneath her polished image and radiant presence, Tara longed for something more: stability, love, and a future that felt certain. Those who knew her best said she carried both ambition and vulnerability, though you would rarely see her without her trademark smile. In Ocilla, Tara was a constant. Her presence was expected everywhere, at the school, at pageants, at local gatherings. And that consistency made what happened in late October 2005 all the more unthinkable. That Saturday, the small town bustled with excitement. It was the weekend of the Miss Sweet Potato pageant, and as always, Tara was there to guide her students, coaching them with the same patience and passion that had made her a standout competitor years before. She was seen laughing, chatting, and encouraging those she mentored. To everyone around her, it was just another ordinary evening. But when Tara drove back to her modest home later that night, something shifted. For reasons no one could see, no one could predict, Tara Grinstead would never emerge from that house again. By Monday morning, her absence was undeniable. The teacher who never missed class, the woman whose schedule was as dependable as the sunrise, was suddenly gone. In towns like Ocilla, news doesn't just spread, it explodes. Within hours, whispers turned into panic, and panic turned into dread. Because if someone like Tara could vanish, then safety itself was an illusion. What happened behind those closed doors on that October night? Who, or what, waited for her when she came home? And how could the life of a woman so deeply rooted in her community simply vanish, leaving only silence behind? Saturday, October 22nd, 2005. For most people in Ocilla, it was just another weekend in a small Georgia town. For Tara Grinstead, it was a day filled with the routines she loved: coaching, mentoring, and showing up for her students. By evening, the Miss Sweet Potato pageant had wrapped up, and the excitement of the local competition carried over into a friendly cookout. Guests remembered Tara arriving dressed casually, smiling, her energy as warm as always. She mingled, laughed, and shared conversations that seemed so ordinary, so forgettable at the time. No one there could have guessed they would be the last to see her alive. She left the gathering around 11 p.m., heading back to her small single-story house on West Park Street. From the outside, it was the picture of suburban simplicity. A cozy home with a porch light that usually stayed on. Neighbors later recalled seeing her car, a black Mitsubishi, parked neatly in the driveway that night. Everything looked normal, quiet, safe. But by the next morning, something subtle had already shifted. Calls to Tara's phone went unanswered. Friends assumed she was resting, maybe busy. On Sunday evening, she was expected to visit her mother, but she never arrived. That small break in her predictable pattern was the first ripple in what would soon become a tidal wave of panic. By Monday morning, the alarm bells could no longer be ignored. At Irwin County High School, where Tara's presence was as certain as the ringing of the first bell, her absence sent shockwaves. She hadn't called in sick. She hadn't sent word. Her classroom sat empty, her desk untouched. For a teacher as devoted as Tara, this was unthinkable. Coworkers called her home. No answer. Friends stopped by, knocking on the door. Silence. By mid-morning, the realization hit with chilling clarity. Tara Grinstead had vanished. When law enforcement arrived, the scene only deepened the mystery. Her Mitsubishi was still parked in the driveway. Inside the house, her cell phone and purse remained untouched. The lights were off, the door locked. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if she had simply stepped outside and disappeared into thin air. But one item stood out, something that didn't belong. Lying in her front yard, just feet from the porch, was a single latex glove. At first, it seemed almost trivial, like a discarded remnant of yard work. But in a case where nothing else seemed out of place, that glove would take on a sinister significance. Neighbors were interviewed. Some recalled hearing dogs barking that night, but no screams, no struggle. Others swore they saw nothing unusual. It was Ocilla. People looked out for each other, but no one was watching for danger because danger simply didn't belong here. As the day stretched on, worry turned into organized chaos. A missing persons report was filed. Volunteers began searching. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood. Helicopters swept the fields and woods surrounding town. And yet, there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that pointed to where Tara might have gone. For Ocilla, the unease grew unbearable. A town that prided itself on knowing every face, every car that passed down its streets, suddenly had no answers. Fear spread quickly. If someone like Tara, a woman whose life was intertwined with nearly everyone's in town, could vanish so completely, then no one was safe. The rumor mill churned. Was it a jealous ex-boyfriend? A stranger passing through? Or someone much closer to home? Everyone seemed to have a theory, but no one had the truth. The silence around Tara's disappearance wasn't just disturbing. It was suffocating. In a community built on familiarity and trust, her absence left a void that swallowed the town whole. And just days into the investigation, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The mystery of Tara Grinstead would not be solved quickly. This wasn't a simple missing person case. It was something far darker. Because if the answer was out there, hidden in plain sight, then why did it feel like everyone in Ocilla was suddenly blind? From the very first days after Tara Grinstead's disappearance, the case was treated with urgency. State investigators, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, and local law enforcement all converged on Ocilla, determined to find answers. The missing teacher's story spread quickly through television and newspapers, her face appearing on national broadcasts within days. In the small town of Ocilla, investigators combed through every street and every field. Search dogs traced the air for her scent. Helicopters scanned pecan orchards and wooded lots, and volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through tall grass and farmland. But despite the overwhelming manpower, there was nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no tracks leading away from her home. The only tangible piece of evidence remained the latex glove. It was carefully bagged and sent for forensic testing. Weeks later, investigators announced that DNA had been found on it, belonging to both Tara and an unknown male. It was a discovery that electrified the case, and yet it brought no resolution. The DNA didn't match anyone in state or federal databases. Without a name, without a face, the glove was a clue that seemed to taunt the investigators more than guide them. Meanwhile, the community lived under a shadow. Ocilla was small, the kind of place where people waved at passing cars and left their doors unlocked. But the disappearance fractured that sense of security. Suddenly, everyone was a suspect. Friends eyed friends. Neighbors whispered about neighbors. Theories spread through diners, barbershops, and church pews. Some believed a stranger had wandered into town. Others were certain it had to be someone close to her, someone who knew Tara's routines. Investigators followed every lead, no matter how thin. They interviewed former boyfriends, colleagues, and acquaintances. They checked out sex offenders in the area. Hundreds of tips poured in, each one raising hope, only to fade into another dead end. Months passed, then years. Every anniversary of her disappearance brought renewed media attention, vigils, and sorrow. Her family begged for answers. Her students mourned the absence of their beloved teacher. and detectives continued to chase rumors that led nowhere. The glove was retested with advancing technology as the years went on, but still no match appeared. The case remained frozen, preserved in headlines but absent of progress. Meanwhile, the story grew beyond Ocilla. National programs like America's Most Wanted and 2020 featured Tara's case, putting a spotlight on Irwin County and the mystery that lingered there. The attention brought waves of tips and speculation, but again, no breakthrough. Behind the scenes, investigators carried their frustration like a weight. They knew the answers were out there, but the silence in Ocilla was deafening. It wasn't just a lack of evidence. It was as though an entire community had been bound by an invisible code of secrecy. People whispered, but few spoke out loud. The years carved away at hope. Families moved forward, students graduated, and still Tara's home on West Park Street remained a haunting reminder. Her car was eventually returned to her family. Her belongings were boxed up, but the unanswered question lingered in every corner of Ocilla. Who took Tara, and why? By 2015, 10 years after her disappearance, the case had grown ice cold. Law enforcement admitted they had exhausted nearly every resource. Her family, devastated but determined, held on to the belief that someone knew something, and that time might finally loosen tongues. But in those silent years, another force was brewing, one that no detective could have predicted. A cultural shift in how crime stories were told was about to change everything. And Tara's case, after sitting dormant for more than a decade, was about to be pulled back into the spotlight by an unlikely source. Not a cop, not a private investigator, but a young filmmaker with a microphone. And in 2016, the silence that had cloaked Ocilla for more than a decade was about to be shattered. By 2016, Tara Grinstead's name had faded from national headlines. To many outside of Ocilla, she was just another cold case in a country full of them. But inside that small Georgia town, her absence was still an open wound. Teachers still remembered the smile that lit up her classroom. Former students carried memories of her encouragement. Her family clung to fading hope, even as the years felt like a cruel echo chamber. Then, something unexpected happened. A young filmmaker named Payne Lindsay, fascinated by unsolved mysteries, stumbled across Tara's case while searching the internet for documentary ideas. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't an insider. He was just a curious storyteller, armed with curiosity, determination, and a microphone. In August of 2016, Payne launched a podcast called Up and Vanished. At first, it was just a passion project, a way to explore what had happened to the beauty queen who had disappeared without a trace. But almost immediately, it began to snowball. Listeners from across the country tuned in, drawn to Payne's raw narration, his willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, and the haunting silence that still surrounded Ocilla. For Tara's community, the podcast was like a stone thrown into still water. Long-buried whispers began to surface. People who had stayed quiet for over a decade suddenly felt the pressure of national attention pressing in on them. Calls poured in. Old acquaintances were re-interviewed. Rumors that had been passed quietly in backyards and kitchens suddenly made their way into public conversation. As Payne dug deeper, his podcast episodes revealed a town caught between loyalty and fear. Some residents bristled at the attention, angry that an outsider was reopening old wounds, but others felt liberated. At last, someone was demanding answers. The timing was perfect. Social media amplified every episode, and soon Up and Vanished was not just a podcast, it was a movement. Millions of listeners tuned in, making it one of the most downloaded true crime podcasts in history. What had once been a dormant case now felt alive, pulsing with new energy. And behind the scenes, that attention created real pressure. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, once criticized for a case that had gone cold, found itself under the microscope again. Tips that had been ignored or dismissed years earlier suddenly resurfaced. Whispers began pointing toward two men who had once walked the halls of Irwin County High School as Tara's students, Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes. For years, their names had floated in low tones around Ocilla. Nothing concrete, nothing bold enough to break through the silence. But now, with Payne's podcast stirring the pot, those whispers became harder to ignore. Investigators began quietly re-examining their files. And in February of 2017, less than a year after the podcast launched, the GBI shocked the world. Ryan Duke was arrested for the murder of Tara Grinstead. The news hit Ocilla like a thunderclap. A face they had known, a former student of Tara's, was paraded in handcuffs, accused of the crime that had haunted the town for over a decade. Alongside him, another name surfaced, Bo Dukes, accused of helping cover up the crime and dispose of Tara's body. It was the break that Tara's family had begged for. But the revelation raised even more questions than it answered. Why had it taken 12 years for the truth to come out? Why had so many people stayed silent? And most chilling of all, what exactly had happened on that October night in 2005? The podcast had done what law enforcement alone could not. It cracked open a wall of secrecy. But with that breakthrough came a dark, harrowing truth. The world would soon learn just how Tara's life had ended, and the details would haunt her community forever. The confessions were coming, and with them, a horrifying journey into a pecan orchard where Tara's final moments were forever erased. When investigators announced the arrest of Ryan Duke in February 2017, the world expected clarity. After 12 years of silence, surely the mystery of Tara Grinstead's disappearance was finally solved. But instead of closure, what followed was a tangled web of confessions, contradictions, and lingering doubts. Ryan Duke, gaunt and almost ghost-like in his first court appearance, seemed an unlikely killer. Yet in the interrogation room, he told investigators that he had broken into Tara's home on that October night. He claimed he never meant to kill her, that it was a burglary gone wrong. He said he struck her, panicked, and then called his friend, Bo Dukes, to help him cover up the crime. The details were chilling. According to Ryan, Tara's body was taken to a remote pecan orchard owned by Bo's family. There, under a cloak of darkness, her remains were destroyed in a fire that would burn for days. When investigators searched the orchard years later, they found traces, small fragments of bone and ash scattered in the soil. The orchard had swallowed Tara whole, leaving almost nothing behind. For her family, it was a devastating revelation. Not only had they lost their daughter, their sister, their friend, they would never even have a body to lay to rest. But then came the twist. Ryan Duke recanted. In a stunning reversal, he claimed his confession was false, that he had been coerced, and that the real killer was Bo Dukes. He insisted Bo had killed Tara, and he had been dragged into the cover-up against his will. The conflicting stories cast a dark cloud over the entire case. Which version was true? Was Ryan genuinely guilty, or was he a pawn shielding his friend? And why, for over a decade, had both men remained silent while Tara's family searched for answers? Bo Dukes, for his part, admitted his involvement, but only in disposing of Tara's body. He painted Ryan as the killer, the one who struck the fatal blow. To investigators, it seemed like two men locked in a macabre dance, each pointing the finger at the other. The orchard itself became a symbol of the town's torment. Families had passed it for years, never knowing it held the secret to Tara's disappearance. When the truth surfaced, it wasn't just a location. It was a graveyard of trust, a reminder of how darkness had hidden in plain sight. For the community, the revelations cut deep. Ryan and Bo weren't strangers. They weren't outsiders. They were men who had grown up in Ocilla, attended the same schools, walked the same streets. And now they stood accused of committing and concealing one of the most heinous crimes the town had ever seen. Still, critical questions remained unanswered. Why Tara? Why that night? Was it truly a burglary gone wrong, or something more sinister? Some wondered if jealousy, obsession, or anger had played a role. Others whispered that more people knew what had happened than were admitting. The air was thick with suspicion, and the silence that had once cloaked Ocilla felt even more unbearable now that fragments of the truth had surfaced. The trials ahead promised answers. But as the community soon discovered, the road to justice would only deepen the mystery. Because in the courtroom, truth and lies would blur once again. And Tara's family would learn that even with confessions, closure remained heartbreakingly out of reach. By the time the arrests were made, Tara Grinstead had been gone for more than a decade. Families had raised children. Students she once taught had become adults. And the quiet town of Ocilla had carried on under the shadow of her absence. Now, the long-awaited trials promised something her family had craved for years: answers. But justice, when it finally came, was not as clear as anyone hoped. In 2019, Dukes faced the courtroom first, not for murder, but for his role in the cover-up. Jurors listened as prosecutors described the pecan orchard, the fire, and the deliberate destruction of Tara's remains. It was not only a crime against Tara, but an offense against truth itself, erasing evidence, silencing her voice, and tormenting her family. The verdict was swift: guilty. Dukes was sentenced to 25 years in prison. For some, it felt like a victory. For others, it was too little, too late. After all, he had walked free for more than a decade while Tara's loved ones lived with nothing but questions. Then came the trial of Ryan Duke in 2022. Expectations were high. This was the man who had once confessed to killing Tara. Surely this would bring the closure her family deserved. But the proceedings unfolded like a storm. Ryan's defense painted him as a man coerced into confession, vulnerable and manipulated. The prosecution fought back with the fragments of his own words, pointing to his past admissions. In the end, the jury stunned the courtroom. Ryan Duke was acquitted of murder, yet he was convicted of concealing Tara's death and sentenced to 10 years in prison. For Tara's family, it was a bittersweet outcome. A conviction, yes, but not for the crime that had stolen their daughter and sister. The truth still felt elusive, slipping like sand through their fingers. The trials provided pieces of a puzzle, but not the whole picture. Who truly killed Tara? Was it Ryan, as his first confession said? Or Bo, as Ryan later claimed? Or was the full truth buried with her in the ashes of that orchard? Even with two men behind bars, the sense of finality never arrived. For Ocilla, the damage was lasting. A small town once defined by community pride now carried the infamy of a national tragedy. The case had exposed fractures, secrets kept, whispers ignored, loyalties misplaced. It left neighbors questioning how such a crime could remain hidden in plain sight for so long. For Tara's family, the heartbreak was sharper. There would be no gravesite to visit, no remains to lay to rest, no peaceful goodbye. The orchard had stolen even that. All they had left were memories. A radiant daughter who crowned beauty pageants with grace. A teacher who inspired students with compassion. A sister whose smile could brighten even the darkest room. And for the world beyond Ocilla, Tara's story became a reflection of something larger. The way silence can shield truth. The way justice can feel incomplete. And the way a single life can echo far beyond the boundaries of a small Georgia town. Even now, after trials, convictions, and years of scrutiny, the case of Tara Grinstead lingers in the air like an unfinished sentence. Justice was served, but only in fragments. The orchard may hold its secrets forever. Her story reminds us that closure is not always possible, that even in courtrooms and headlines, the truth can remain obscured. And yet, her legacy lives on, not in the way she died, but in the way she lived, with beauty, purpose, and an unshakable impact on those who loved her. Because in the end, the mystery of Tara Grinstead is not just about who took her life, but about the silence that allowed the truth to hide for so long. And in that silence, the haunting question remains: will we ever truly know?